Good morning. It's my joy to bring you a devotion today, and today we're going to do a character study on the life of Obadiah. And when I say Obadiah, you're probably thinking of the Old Testament book that bears that name. So while you find that, I'm going to go get a cup of coffee, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Just kidding. You don't need to find Obadiah. But I would encourage you to find 1 Kings chapter 18, and we're going to look at one of the 13 different Obadiahs that are mentioned in the Old Testament. This one has some particular interesting lessons, some things about his life that I think would be good exhortation for us this morning. So I want to share these thoughts with you in just a few brief moments here. The story begins, or we're going to jump into the story here in 1 Kings 18 and verse 3, and we find out that Obadiah is the governor of Ahab's house. Now, the word governor, the New Testament equivalent would probably be steward, overseer, manager, the lord of the house. In other words, Obadiah is the overseer and manager of all the things to do with Ahab's household. At this point, Ahab is the most wicked king Israel has ever seen. So we have a governor serving in the house, the wicked house of Ahab. The story proceeds from verse 3. Ahab is calling Obadiah in, and he's dividing up the land, and Ahab's going to go this way, and he's sending Obadiah to go this way, and we're gonna search out the land to find grazing for our flocks and our herds. So Obadiah, you go that way, I'm going this way. As Obadiah is traveling throughout the land, he encounters Elijah the prophet. Elijah is the nemesis of Ahab. He is the most hated man in Israel by King Ahab. And Elijah said to Obadiah, "You go tell Ahab, I want to meet him here. I'm here. I'm waiting for him. He needs to come and see me." Now, Elijah is doing that at the prompting of the Lord from chapter 18, verse 1, where God said to Elijah, "Go show yourself to Ahab." So there's going to be an encounter here. So Obadiah, you go back and tell him that I want to see him. Now, that caused some fear in Obadiah. We're going to see how he responded to that. I want you to note several things about this man named Obadiah. First of all, in verse 3, it says he feared the Lord greatly. That's actually a parenthesis at the end of verse 3. He's the governor of the house, and it says, now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. That's a strange place for somebody to be a God-fearing person in such a wicked household. If you look at the end of verse 12, when Obadiah is in conversation with Elijah, he says about himself, he said, I, thy servant, fear the Lord from my youth. So let me point out two lessons there on that thought. First of all, to fear the Lord does not mean you're scared of him. Nowhere in the Bible does the fear of the Lord equate with emotional fear, being scared of something or someone. Proverbs describes fear in so many different ways, but it says these things. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days. It is strong confidence. It is a fountain of life to depart from the snares of death. The fear of the Lord tendeth to life, and he that hath it shall abide satisfied. 1 Peter 1:17 says, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. None of those things refer to any fear being an emotional anxiety. The fear of the Lord is honestly you and I being afraid of displeasing the Lord. It is not fearing him, it is fearing displeasing him. It is having such a high and holy reverence for him that we have a passionate heart to please him, and we fear not doing that. I heard the story of a teenage girl who was in the company of some other teenage girls that were getting ready to get into something they shouldn't be doing. And they were trying to intimidate this girl into going along with them. Why don't you come with us? Why don't you do this? And they were teasing her by saying, are you afraid your daddy's going to hurt you? And her response was, no, I'm afraid I'm going to hurt my dad. And that's how we ought to be toward the Lord. Not we are afraid God's going to hurt us, but we're afraid we're going to hurt God. I don't think you can ever backslide until you first lose your fear of disobedience. You can't really get away from God and get away from obedience until you first lose your fear of disobedience. And we ought to have a healthy fear of not living the life that would be pleasing to the Lord. Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. From verse 12, I want you to see this. He said at the end of verse 12, I, thy servant, have feared the Lord. I, thy servant, fear the Lord from my youth. So it started when he was young. He had parents that trained him in the way of the Lord. He must have. Somebody back there taught him to have a fear of the Lord. Somebody taught him to follow the Lord. And so we see in this the value of training our children in the way they should go. We see the responsibility that is given to us in Deuteronomy 6, that we're to hide the truth of God in our hearts, and we're to pass it on to our children. It is the responsibility of parents to share the truth of God with their children. And he said, I have feared the Lord from my youth. Now that not only notes that he began to follow the Lord when he was young, but he has continued to follow the Lord. Now think about where he is. He's in the house of Ahab. He's living in one of the most wicked households in the world at that point, and he is faithfully fearing God and following God. That had to be a tough thing. And the exhortation for us is that we can follow the Lord right where we are. It doesn't matter what our surroundings are, that God can use us wherever we are. And Obadiah followed the Lord for many years, even in a difficult situation. He stayed faithful. Proverbs says, most men will proclaim every one his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find? It's kind of a rare thing to find someone who is faithful over the long haul. And we ought to strive to be faithful to God in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. And we ought to strive to be faithful to God over the long haul. From our youth all the way up, serving the Lord and faithful to Him. Let me point out specifically now that Obadiah served God and was faithful in a very difficult place. I've already alluded to that. But being the chief steward or the governor of Ahab's household, let me tell you how wicked this man was. And right here in our text, 1 Kings 16, verse 30, it says, Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Verse 33 says, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. Chapter 21, verse 25 takes it even deeper, because it says, there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord. He sold himself into it. He did it on purpose. He was wicked on purpose. And here's a man named Obadiah serving in that household, faithfully following God. How is that possible? And why would God put a person there? Somebody might say, well, he should have got out of there. He should have got another job. Not necessarily. How about Joseph? Joseph was a prisoner, but elevated to the second in command over all of Egypt and ended up saving his own family, serving the Lord in a very wicked place. How about Daniel being a captive in Babylon and became a great influence in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar? God used him there. Mordecai sat at the king's gate in a wicked land and became instrumental in helping Esther save her people, the Jews. Paul spoke about the saints in Caesar's household. There were people who worked in the household of Caesar, the man who was killing Christians, but they faithfully served the Lord. So let's not ever say to anybody, it's hard to serve the Lord where I am, because we have multiple examples of people serving the Lord faithfully in very, very difficult and trying circumstances. Let's look at verse 5 of this chapter and find something else interesting about this man. 1 Kings 18, verse 5. It says, Ahab said unto Obadiah, go into the land and all the fountains of water. It's verse 4. For it was so when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, that means that she was killing prophets, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50 in a cave and fed them with bread and water. So while he's serving in the household of Ahab, he's helping hide the prophets of the Lord from their own death at the hand of Jezebel and making sure they had food so they could survive. He's doing the work of the Lord unknown to everyone around him. Later in the chapter, in his conversation with Elijah, he said to Elijah, didn't you know about that? I'm paraphrasing. But didn't you know about that, that I hid 50 prophets in the cave? So he's doing something for the Lord that not everybody knows about, but it's making a huge difference. Imagine the impact, the potential impact of 50 prophets who were spared with the help of Obadiah, and the impact they could have on the land in future years. Nobody knew about it, but he was doing the right thing. Could I point out something else about him? He was human. When Elijah said, "Go tell Ahab I want to see him," 3 times Obadiah said, "If I do that, he's going to kill me." He says it in verse 9. He says it in verse 12. He says it in verse 14. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. He was afraid to go tell Ahab, "Elijah wants to see you." He knew how much Ahab hated Elijah. But you know what he did? He went and told him. He did what the man of God asked him to do. It's not unusual for people with great courage to also have a lot of fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is taking a stand in the presence of fear. If you allow fear to overrule, you will never do what the Lord wants. But in spite of his fear, he stepped out in obedience. The Bible's full of examples of that too. Moses feared going back to stand before Pharaoh, but he did it. Elijah didn't want to stand before Ahab, but he's following through and obeying the Lord, and he's going to show himself to Ahab. The last thing I want you to see is, just by being faithful to do that, Obadiah made a great contribution to what was coming. You never know the act of obedience that you're gonna follow through on today. You never know what that's going to bring back in the future. Do you know what happens after Obadiah goes to Ahab and says, "Elijah's here and he wants to meet you"? When those two met, Ahab and Elijah met, Elijah said, "You gather all the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, we're going to have a showdown." And you know what a great victory God wrought there. 450 prophets of Baal were slain. So just by simply obeying the Lord, obeying the leadership he had been given from Elijah the prophet, "Go back and tell Ahab to come see me," that's the victory God gave on the mountain. A story that's still being preached about thousands of years later. It may have seemed like an insignificant thing at that moment, but it had a great impact on the work of the Lord. And so, you know, your encouraging word to a friend, you never know what kind of impact that's going to have. In our recent encounters with people in the church, where we're not able to have church and not able to have regular services right now, in our recent encounters with church members, they have given us such encouraging words, and it sure has meant a lot to our hearts. Your faithfulness to the house of God when things are normal and church attendance can be normal. Your faithful giving. I think about missionaries on the field who are serving in ways that no one knows about. But they're busy serving the Lord. They're faithful, doing what they can, where they can, with what they have. And our faithful giving is still making that possible. It's all making a contribution to the work of God. Whatever it is, it's all making a contribution to the work of God in ways that we may never understand until we get to heaven. So my encouragement to you today is to stay faithful. Serve where you are. Do what you can where you are. Do what you can with what God has given you. And be courageous in the face of fear. Don't give in to fear. Don't be scared of the circumstances. Rise above the circumstances. And God will use you for His glory. I hope those thoughts encourage your heart, and I hope you have a wonderful day today. May God bless you.